Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dennis Boers, Sea Change Team Leader, and I would like to welcome all of you to the 5th Sea Change webinar, and that is the second webinar in the 2012 series. Welcome to all the attendees who have already logged in, and also a warm welcome to our presenter, Ms. Nicolina Lamhauge, of the OECD Environment Directorate, who I will introduce in a moment. Welcome also to Ms. Sang-Lee King as part of the panel who works for Sea Change on webinar development. And unfortunately, at the moment I do not see any of the other panelists that I anticipated being here. And I also got a number of emails that people were sick in bed with the flu, which does mean that with the question and answer moment at the end, I do expect the attendees to ask a little bit more questions than normal, because normally the panelists are there as well to ask questions. Some of the attendees this afternoon are already Sea Change members and already know about us. But for those who are new to Sea Change, I would like to explain that Sea Change is a community of practice with currently 170 members that develops a culture of high quality and rigorous M&E frameworks, approaches and methodologies for adaptive responses to climate change interventions and practices in Southeast Asia and beyond. And this webinar, Monitoring and Evaluation for Adaptation, Lessons from Development Cooperation Agencies, is as such a welcome addition to support its members in expanding their knowledge on climate change related M&E issues. Webinars are one way in which Sea Change is sharing best practices and lessons learned, guidelines and approaches. But apart from that, next to the webinars, we also send out a weekly newsletter. We maintain a resource library online, and we support our members in publishing their work and in speaking engagements at conferences, and we also partner with other like-minded networks and communities. If you would like more information, I would like to guide you to our website, which is www.seachangecop.org. A little bit of logistics information for this webinar session. The webinar presentation will take 30 to 40 minutes, after which there will be time for questions and answers. You can type your questions in the question field in the software, after which we will present the questions to our presenter, Ms. Nicolina Lamhauge, or you can raise your hand and ask the question verbally. On the next slide, I will show you where you will find the question field and the hand raising button. Any questions that have not been answered during the 30-minute Q&A session will be answered offline and published on our website, together with a recording of the webinar. If you are looking at the webinar environment, you have a little hand icon, which is the option to raise your hand, and below that you have a question window. And as said, any questions not answered during the Q&A session will be answered later on offline and put on our website. As a last part of this introduction, let me now introduce to you our presenter of today, Ms. Nicolina Lamhauge of the OECD. The OECD Environment Directorate is at the forefront of environmental and climate change. Someone is breathing quite heavily in the microphone. The OECD Environment Directorate is at the forefront of environmental and climate change analysis, promoting environmentally and economically rational policies related to adaptation, mitigation, technology, financing and development. Nicolina Lamhauge's work at the OECD focuses on the linkages between environment and climate change adaptation in developing countries. Nicolina has also worked on policy guidance on enhancing capacity for greening development. And with an academic background in development studies, she worked in South Asia for 2 years prior to joining the OECD. This webinar is based on OECD's Working Paper 38 with the same title, Monitoring and Evaluation for Adaptation, Lessons from Development Cooperation Agencies, of which Ms. Lamhauge is one of the authors. This working paper is the first empirical assessment of M&E frameworks used by development cooperation agencies for projects and programs with adaptation-specific or adaptation-related components. It has analyzed 106 project documents across 6 bilateral development agencies. Ms. Lamhauge will now share her findings from the first empirical assessment of M&E frameworks used by development agencies for their adaptation, specific and related interventions. Comparing the approaches used by 6 development agencies, Nicolina will focus on the particular characteristics of M&E in the context of adaptation and what lessons can be learned on the choice and use of indicators for adaptation. Nicolina, I will now give the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and good afternoon here from Paris. As Dennis mentioned, I will share some lessons from a paper I wrote together with 2 colleagues here at the OECD, Elisa Lansi and Shardo Agrawala. In doing so, I will briefly provide the context for writing this paper and then illustrate what data and methodology we use for writing the paper. I will then briefly outline some of the M&E approaches we identified in the projects and program documents we analyzed for this paper before moving on to the use and choice of indicators that the agencies used. My presentation will focus primarily on this section on indicators. But before drawing some conclusions, I will also touch on the use of baselines, milestones, and targets. So in the context of scaled-up finance for climate change, it's widely agreed that it's more important than ever to show that the money for adaptation is being effectively spent. Fortunately, there's already a lot of work being done on this topic. Earlier work focused on the categorization of adaptation interventions and the challenges evaluators faced when trying to monitor and evaluate adaptation. More recently, work done by institutions such as the IDS and WRI, IIED, in collaboration with DFID and GIZ, have proposed M&E frameworks actually suggested on how monitoring and evaluation for adaptation can be done. And some of the climate funds and mechanisms have then taken this one step further and actually developed M&E frameworks that they're currently implementing. So for this paper, we decided to focus on development agencies and see what we could learn from their established practice of evaluating their activities. Most development agencies also have a long history in implementing projects and programs in climate-sensitive areas. And many of these activities have what we call adaptation-related components. So as such, they are not labeled adaptation, but they include the characteristics that what we now call adaptation activities include. And examples are climate-resilient infrastructure or drought and flood-resilient crops. So this paper draws on the experience of 6 agencies in evaluating both their adaptation specific but also their adaptation-like activities. And these agencies are Canadian CDAM, the UK DFID, the Dutch DGIS, the Japanese JICA, the Swiss SDC, and the Swedish CDA. So by comparing the approaches used by the 6 agencies, the objective of the paper was, as Dennis mentioned, to get a better understanding of the particular characteristics of M&E in the context of adaptation, and to see if there are any best practices in the choice and use of indicators for adaptation. So the data we use for this paper consists of documents for 106 projects and programs. And this includes both ex-ante evaluations and ex-post evaluations, as well as a number of monitoring documents and tools. So for some of the 106 projects, we received the full package of M&E documents, while in the more recent climate-funded activities, we often just have the ex-ante evaluation. Most of the documents were directly provided by the agencies, but some of them were also publicly available online. And the documents we reviewed cover different themes and geographical areas, but they tend to be concentrated in developing countries, with a few also looking at located in emerging economies such as China, India, and Indonesia. So this figure shows the broad distribution of the projects and programs, where the darker colors illustrate a higher number of activities. So as you can see, there's a high concentration of activities in Southeast Asia, vulnerable to climate extreme events, but also to Africa and South America that often experience water shortages and floods. So this table outlines a small subject section of the activities we received from the 6 agencies. As I mentioned, some of the documents were funded through climate funds or programs, but we decided to also include projects and programs that had indirect adaptation components. The reason for this is that activities with adaptation-related components have been underway for a longer period of time and are therefore more likely to have finished or completed the M&E cycle. The advantage on the other side of including adaptation-specific activities that may only have the ex-ante evaluation is that these have already taken the first step in identifying indicators, baselines, and targets appropriate for the context of adaptation. So as you can see, the sample is quite diverse and ranges from flood management in the Philippines to capacity building in Vietnam. I should note that this particular table only includes activities located in Asia, but that the sample is much broader than that, as you saw in the figure earlier. So when we started to analyze the project, we grouped the documents into 5 categories. The first looks at climate risk reduction that reduces people's or communities' vulnerability to climate change. And this includes infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure, or flood prevention, climate resilient crops, etc. The second category includes activities on policy and administrative management, and focuses mainly on mainstreaming adaptation into national planning processes. The third category on education, training and awareness on climate change focuses primarily on dissemination and information on climate change and capacity building. The third category is primarily on the climate scenarios and development of climate scenarios and impact research and how this is being used. And the final category on coordination is linking institutions and stakeholders in dialogue and decision-making processes related to climate change. So it can be argued that the degree to which these activities contribute to adaptation varies. So for example, climate risk reduction activities often have a direct impact on people's ability to adapt to climate change, for example, by farming more climate resilient crops. Policy making, on the other hand, ensures that adaptation is being mainstreamed, but as such it's a longer term process that the benefits will not immediately be felt by people on the ground. And this is also the case on, for example, training and education, where it improves people's ability to integrate adaptation into their future planning, but as does not necessarily have an immediate impact on their adaptability. So I will now briefly outline some of the M&E approaches we identified in our sample before I move on to looking at the indicators that were used. So we found that result-based management and the logical framework approach are the most common M&E approaches across the 6 agencies. This is not surprising, given that in our sample we included adaptation-like activities, which at their core are development activities, and most agencies used result-based management or the logical framework approach to evaluate these activities. Most of the agencies also distinguish between activities, outputs, and
Nicolina, I don't hear you anymore. Nicolina, can you hear me? It seems we are having a technical difficulty at the side of our presenter. Let me see if I can reach her and see what the problem is.
Included information on activity, outputs, outcomes, and impact. For each of these, there was then a brief description on the objective of the activity or the output, as presented in this case. And then complementing the description are indicators on how the activities or outputs will be measured. And then the means of verification, and finally also assumption. Can you hear me okay? I'm getting a message on my screen.
Yeah, I hear you fine right now.
Okay, I will continue then. So another agency divided its log frame between the goal, purpose, and output. Also here there was a description for each of the components with corresponding indicators. But as you can see in this table, there's a larger distinction between the baselines, shorter term milestones, slightly longer term milestones, and the final targets. And then there's an information on the source of how the indicators will be measured, and finally on assumptions. What is added in this approach is also the relative impact of or relative weighting of the various outputs. So in this case, on the table on the screen, this is output 1, but the total log frame included a number of outputs where each of them had a weighting. And what is not included in this table is also information on the number of agencies that were part of the process, and the roles of each of the agencies and the relative contribution, financial contribution of each of the agencies. This more differentiated use of baselines, milestones, and targets proved to be particularly useful when monitoring the activities. And it can be argued that this is very important in the context of climate change, where baselines and targets change over time. A third agency did not use log frames in its ex-ante evaluation. Instead, the ex-ante evaluation provided a broad description of project activities, costs, and timelines, and then instead of using detailed indicators for every component, the ex-ante evaluation just focused on a few factors or components of the intervention. So it can be argued that while the benefit of this third approach is that it gives managers more flexibility to revise the project over time, it also gives evaluators the opportunity to evaluate unintended components of an activity. This is often a critique of the more standard log frame approaches that are accused of being very static and not allowing for revisions over time. At the same time, this third approach that you see on the screen requires that the evaluators has a very good understanding of the broad objectives of the activity in order not to lose sight when evaluating whether targets have been achieved. Also, before moving on to the use of indicators, it's worth mentioning at this point that the nature of the M&E frameworks that we analyzed did not seem to be determined by the location of the activity, but rather by the agency that was funding the activity. So I'll now turn to the use of indicators in our sample. So as you know, indicators are a core component of monitoring and evaluation. They show how results will be measured, and they provide an overview of how things change over time. They also help project staff to prioritize inputs and to communicate outcomes. Indicators, they can range from input indicators to process, output, and outcome indicators. Traditionally, development agencies have focused on outputs since they have less control over, so they have focused on outputs, since they have less control over outcomes. And here the traditional example is the number of schools built versus school attendance. So while an agency can go into an area, build a school, and then say, well, we accomplished what we set out to do, it's harder for them to really have a large impact on the number of children attending school after the construction is finished. But this focus on outputs is also risks overstating results, because if the school then remains empty after the agency left, the long-term impact on the community is fairly limited. So because of this, agencies are more and more shifting their focus to outcomes rather than outputs. Finally, indicators can be categorical. Has a policy been developed? Yes and no. It can be quantitative, how many bridges have been constructed, or it can be qualitative. Qualitative indicators will very much depend on the content of the activity. So when we analyzed the project, the indicators were grouped into the broad categories of adaptation activities that I mentioned earlier, on risk reduction, climate policy, education, research, and coordination. So we found that there was a lot of overlap in the use of indicators across the 6 agencies. And I will briefly discuss the kind of indicators used for each of the 5 categories. So as I mentioned earlier, risk reduction measures such as the construction of dikes or new farming techniques were not the primary focus of the sample in this paper. The indicators in this category, they depend on the context of the sector, but they can generally be grouped into two broad categories. There's the quantitative indicators, for example, the number of households benefiting from a risk reduction activity, or the number of risk reduction measures that have been employed. So both of these can either be reported in terms of numbers, so say 1,000 households benefiting from risk reduction activities, or in terms of percentages, so 50% more households now benefit from risk reduction activities. And most agencies use a combination of the two, since the value of each is slightly different. It's difficult to really get a sense of coverage or impact if you just have the numbers. So if you're able to reach 1,000 households in an area that is like 5,000 households, it's different than if you reach 1,000 households and there are 100,000 households. Alternatively, indicators in this category tend to focus on coverage. So, for example, the impact of a climate shock before and after the construction of a dam. And this can be, for example, reported in square meters or in hectares. Some projects also use qualitative indicators such as change in people's adaptive capacity. These, however, can be quite problematic if they require a value judgment by the evaluator. So this table shows an example of indicators used by JICA to evaluate a project on mitigation of flood damages in the Philippines. The project focuses on improvement of drainage channels, rivers and roads. But as you can see, instead of monitoring progress on each of these components, the indicators focus on the impacts of floods before and after the project. Here the indicators look at, for example, the depth and duration of a flood, both in terms of frequent floods and less frequent floods, the number of people affected and for how long they have been affected, the money value of flood damage, and also the maximum number of people that can be affected. So as you can see, the project aims to have a significant impact on the more frequent but less devastating floods. The anticipated impact is slightly less for the more devastating, less frequent floods. This differentiation between more and less frequent floods incorporates a level of foresight that we generally do not see in the more enabling-like activities. A second example is a project that aims to build adaptive capacity to reduce people's vulnerability to climate change. This project is based in Bangladesh and focuses on awareness of climate change and associated vulnerabilities. So in collaboration with local partners, the project identified indigenous adaptation measures. And in doing so, the project included 4 components. It looked at household capacity to innovate livelihood strategies that are less vulnerable to climate change, the improved capacity of communities to implement adaptation strategies, the increased capacity of local partners to raise awareness on climate change, and finally, the regular interaction by project partners with national level stakeholders on policy advocacy issues. Here, it can be difficult to define objective indicators for concepts such as adaptive capacity and climate resilient livelihoods. One way of getting around that problematic of adaptive capacity is looking at having an indicator on the number of households that seek out and adapt climate resilient strategies, and also the percentage of households with new livelihood strategies. This this last example, it shows the importance of combining different kinds of indicators, especially when evaluating slightly more ambiguous concepts. There was a lot of overlap between the indicators that broadly fall under the theme of policy and administrative management. It can, for example, be mentioned that 5 out of the 6 agencies included indicators on coverage of climate change adaptation strategies. But depending on the type of projects, indicators can either be tended to be either binary indicators or quantitative targets. So an example of binary indicators include: has a national adaptation program been drafted? Do all government disaster programs include climate change, or are local disaster management local disaster management plans in place? And for all of these, they're relatively easy to monitor with checkboxes, where the answer usually will be yes or no. But on their own, these binary indicators, the value of them is fairly limited, because the development of a policy does not necessarily ensure that it has been implemented. So supplementing the binary indicators with often quantitative targets, such as number of policy submissions to UNFCCC, or number of climate adaptation strategies that have been mainstreamed into national regional plans, or number of local ministries that have a climate plan. It is very important to keep in mind that policy processes are complex. As I mentioned, the introduction of a policy will not necessarily result in its implementation. So we found that in this category, it was important in other category of indicators as well, but it was particularly in this category, it's important to look at all the indicators that contribute to the same output or outcome. So I briefly listed an example below, where the first indicator states the number of types of actors that support climate change adaptation, and then level of integration of policy processes, and then finally level of integration in strategies and programs, and at the end the number of beneficiaries that benefit from these strategies and programs. This illustrates the importance of the enabling environment being in place in order to this to be translated into change on the ground. Indicators on education and training included the diffusion of information on climate change risks, or climate change training that was aimed at changing people's kind of capacity to respond to climate change. In this category, quantitative indicators were most common. So as you can see, the number of articles published, the number of trainings conducted, or number of visits on a relevant website. Complementing some of these quantitative indicators are categorical measures, such as the development of a knowledge platform, and this is of course then linked to the quantitative measured on number of visits on this platform. Here, examples of qualitative indicators include the ability of village groups to conduct risk assessments and identify adaptation measures. So while the quantitative indicators can record the number of people that have been trained, it doesn't say so much on the sustainability of the training and whether or not it has been internalized and subsequently applied in practice. So this kind of highlights the importance of combining indicators, and examples of doing so are, for example, the number of educational material produced and the extent of its use and as I mentioned, the number of people trained and the percentage of trained policymakers who applied this information. Here I have listed an example from a project in Bangladesh where one indicator was 300 disaster management committees received training on climate change adaptation, and subsequently 80% developed and adopted their risk reduction plans. Also here you can see the use of using numbers complemented by percentage changes. In this category, it was also important to be careful when evaluating concepts such as ability and capacity. In one project, capacity is measured through seminar material and a participant evaluation at the end of a seminar. But again, on its own, the information that we get from this might be fairly limited, because if there's not an evaluation before and after a seminar, we don't know exactly what people have taken away from the seminar, and even then the end evaluation will probably have to take place a few weeks or maybe a month later, because I mean, as we all know, we retain information for a fairly limited period of time. Indicators in research tended to be binary indicators, such as climate scenarios have been developed and integrated into national development plans, or climate tools have been developed to assess climate threats. It is important that climate studies here are not just created, but they're also used for policy making. And we found this was illustrated in a project in the Nile Basin that aims to improve climate resilience of the communities located around the basin. In the evaluation, the M&E framework examines the development of the climate scenarios, but it also considers whether the information needed will be available and used in the long term. In doing so, they used two complementary indicators. So information from climate scenarios is integrated into national plans, and knowledge platforms become the basis for better information sharing. With this combination of indicators, the evaluation considers the long-term impact of the newly created knowledge on policymaking, but also the need to continue research after project is completed. The last category of indicators looked at the coordination aspect. So all agencies in our sample included components of coordination in some of their activities, but in very few cases was the core or key component of the activity. Instead, for example, many activities of policy mainstreaming included a component on stakeholder consultation or outreach to relevant beneficiaries. Here we can again group the categories into indicators into three broad categories. Quantitative indicators on the number of collaborations between institutions and stakeholders. Second category was binary indicator on the establishment of working groups or dialogue platforms. And the third indicators measures the level of coordination or level of stakeholder participation. So the first two indicators are fairly straightforward in terms of checkboxes of yes or no, or in terms of numbers of how many platforms have been established. But it's harder to objectively measure the level of participation or level of integration, and this will often require a reference scale for the evaluator to draw upon. So for a project in Bangladesh that focused on reducing vulnerability to climate change, one activity aims to establish linkages between research institutions in order to disseminate findings on climate change. And in doing so, they used 3 indicators. One on linkages are established between research organizations, and then research findings are disseminated to 4,000 households. And finally, 75% of households experiment with new technology promoted by the research findings. Here we can see a nice combination of binary indicators, but also on the use of numbers versus percentage change of quantitative indicators. So in the previous slides, it has become clear that every indicator needs a baseline and a target. Baselines provide a reference point against which results can be measured. And this may require the application of climate projections. And when this is done, the use of climate projections demands a certain level of technical expertise. Targets, on the other hand, they provide a benchmark for monitoring and evaluating progress. Also, this may change in the context of climate change. It's interesting to note that most of the documents we analyzed for our study, they didn't use climate projections in setting either baselines or targets. It's possible that this is due to the fact that many of them were development activities with an adaptation-like component, but given all the challenges that we know of in terms of setting baselines and targets in a changing climate, this is a bit surprising that there was so little use of climate projections. Finally, milestones are useful for monitoring progress, and they allow project staff to revise project components also if needed. In addition to few samples or few projects or programs using climate information when setting baselines, we also noted that very few of them include a longer-term component to their M&E frameworks, which is promoted in the context of climate change, since the climate that we are trying to make people more resilient to might not show its impact until for another 20 to 50 years. One example that does show some kind of long-term measure in its M&E framework was the South Asia Water Initiative. This initiative was started in 2009 and ended in 2011. And as you can see, the outcome indicator is set for 3 years after project completion and the target indicator at 7 years after project completion. So while this shows some level of long-term view, it's still fairly limited in the context of climate change. So to briefly summarize, the activities analyzed in our sample aim to reduce vulnerability to climate change by ensuring that the enabling environment is in place or by promoting risk-reducing activities. So as such, they are at their core development indicators, and it's therefore not so surprising that the results-based management and the logical framework approach are the most common M&E frameworks that we identified. It's also clear that the type of activity to a large extent determines the choice of indicators used. A general lesson, however, is that a combination of qualitative, quantitative, and binary indicators are often needed. On their own, any category of indicators is fairly limited. The example I gave earlier was the development of a policy framework, but without a complementary indicator on whether this framework has been implemented, it's fairly limited. Also, if not carefully defined, qualitative indicators will often require a value judgment by the evaluator. Complementary indicators are therefore particularly important when measuring outcomes and impacts. So a small set of indicators with different focus can highlight the various aspects of a project. The example I gave earlier was on the number of people trained versus whether this information or training has been used in practice. Also, when choosing indicators, it's important to carefully define baseline values and make the scale of the project explicit. It might not be enough to report on the number of villages with a new disaster plan, but it might be better to report this with reference to the total number of villages and the area vulnerable to climate change. As was also mentioned, these are often presented as either numbers or percentages. As I also mentioned earlier, the baselines in our sample tended to be based on an assumption of a static climate and did not integrate climate scenarios and models. Also, to evaluate adaptation projects, it may be necessary to extend the timing of the evaluation. So the example I provided earlier, the final evaluation was set to 7 years after project completion. But for adaptation-specific activities, maybe this should be 25 or 50 years after project completion. And finally, there's especially in the section on risk reduction measures, the question arose whether to use detailed indicators for every component of an activity or rather use broader vulnerability assessments. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer to this, and it might also depend on the type and scale of the activity. So for example, for risk reduction measures, a general assessment of whether or not people are becoming less vulnerable might be more appropriate than, for example, training activities aimed at increasing people's adaptive capacity through the introduction of new livelihood activities. So this was a brief introduction to this paper written by myself and colleagues here at the OECD. And I will be more than happy now to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolina, for your presentation. Very clear. I want to open the floor for questions. There is already one question by Jeremy Diner, which I will take in a moment. I will make a little recap that gives the other attendees also the time to send us their questions. The documents for 106 projects and programs were reviewed for this analysis and grouped into 5 broad categories of adaptation to climate change, being risk reduction, policy and administrative management, education, training and awareness, research, and coordination. What was found was that results-based management, the logical framework approach, and the accompanying log frame are the most common approaches used by agencies to distinguish between outcomes, outputs, and activities. And when it comes to outcomes and outputs, the focus is more on outcome with these adaptation activities. The analysis shows also that M&E frameworks for adaptation should combine qualitative, quantitative, and binary indicators. On their own, any category of indicator is not enough. Carefully defined baselines are essential in order to measure project or program impact. In the context of adaptation, this requires consideration of future climate change. Similarly, milestones and targets are required in order to effectively monitor progress and evaluate results in a changing environmental context. In the context of adaptation, M&E activities also need to recognize the longer time horizon of potential climate change impacts and need to be scheduled accordingly. The level of detail included in M&E frameworks for adaptation is likely to depend on the type and scale of the activity. While some have detailed indicators corresponding to every component of an intervention, others focus on an aggregate assessment of change in climate vulnerability. While adaptation projects and programs focus on addressing the risk of climate change, they are at their core development projects. The specific features of adaptation call for refinement rather than for replacement of development agencies' existing M&E frameworks. Important aspects of this in the context of adaptation include developing indicators, baselines, milestones and targets. And the timing of monitoring and evaluation activities also needs to be adjusted to the longer time horizon of many of these adaptation activities. I would like to start with a question, and that's the following one. How did you decide on these 5 categories of adaptation activities?
So when we started to analyze our activity or the top project and program documents, we used what we call the OECD adaptation marker, or the DAC marker. So the adaptation marker was introduced by the Development Assistance Committee here at the OECD to help identify funding flows related to adaptation to climate change. And then these funding flows are recorded in what is called the creditory reporting system. So this is a system that has been developed in order to see where kind of development assistant, money for development assistance or official development assistance, what the target of this money is. So for example, you can filter the information according to, say, water or to gender or to rural livelihoods. But in 2010 they introduced this what is called the adaptation marker, where agencies providing funding for adaptation can start recording this information. A similar marker is also done for or available for climate change mitigation. But the adaptation marker kind of provides indicative categories of adaptation activities, and so we use these categories but adjusted it for our sample.
Okay. No, that's very clear. Let me get to Jeremy Diner's question. He asks the following. Many smaller CCA projects have been funded recently with essentially no obligation for M&E beyond tracking outputs. How would you recommend trying to strengthen the M&E of a project after the log frame, indicators, etc. have already been established and the project is underway?
So just to clarify, the projects are underway and the log frame only includes output indicators but not longer term
correct.
indicators. Well, it's always difficult when a project is already underway, but given that climate related activities are still fairly recent, I would imagine that if there's a log frame in place, that the implementing agencies and the funding and implementing agencies would want to get together and ensure that there are longer term kind of measures of progress integrated, because it's a real problem to focus only on the outputs, and I would say especially in the case of climate change, where the short-term change is going to be relatively smaller compared to the longer-term impacts.
Given the interest in the OECD when it comes to measuring output and outcome, and especially towards adaptation. Is it safe to say that the tracking of output and outcome and M&E within log frames for projects that are supported by the OECD will be becoming more and more important in the future?
Well, I mean, the OECD focuses on policy advice. So as such, we don't have projects or programs that we implement. Instead, we have this tracking system that I mentioned, the DAC tracking system, and we do similar research or working papers as the one I've just been presenting. Mm-hmm. But we don't have any activities ourselves that we implement or fund. But I can add that in terms of research, M&E, both for adaptation but also for mitigation, is becoming more and more important. And this is in part reflected by a demand from countries that are members of the OECD that are faced with this question of how do we evaluate impact of our mitigation activities and our adaptation activities. In the case of mitigation, the difference is that there is a wider agreement of what is being measured, and that's the carbon emission. But in adaptation, the challenge is that it's really difficult to pinpoint what should be measured and how. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's clear. I see another question from Joni Ferdi Wijaya, and he asks, do you differentiate between reactive adaptation and anticipative adaptation among those projects being appraised? And how many projects are reactive and how many projects are anticipative? If you know that at all, I don't know if you know that.
I think that's a really good question, and it's not something we differentiated in our sample. But I think given that we have a fairly large sample of 106 project and programs, it would something that could be interesting to do in follow-up work, and also to see if the M&E approaches differ between the two categories. Well, unfortunately, it's not something we looked at.
Do you have a gut feeling, having gone over 106 documents, what the percentage more or less could be?
I would imagine that the majority are kind of focusing more on the reducing the vulnerability, increasing capacity. So the larger majority will fall in that category.
Okay. I see another question of Bian Gurum, and he asks, the evaluation timeline has to be extended, at times perhaps up to 20 years. Isn't that too long of a timeline? Please help justify.
I think for funding agencies, 20 years is considered too much or too long of a timeline. Mm-hmm. But if the real purpose of the evaluation is to see the impact of an activity on reducing people's or communities' vulnerability to climate change, such timelines are needed, because it's very likely that it's only in the long term that the climate, what we're trying to reduce our vulnerability against, it will only be in the longer term that we see these changes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, it's worth noting that in some cases, what we want to achieve is actually to maintain status quo. Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure that farmers are able to continue harvesting a certain amount of crops every year despite climate change. So this can be done through the implementation of climate resilient crops. But given that the climate will take a long term in changing, we cannot measure whether farmers are still able to harvest the same number of crops until we reach that time. Yeah. So I think it's a very difficult question where funding agencies always will want to see results as soon as possible, but as I mentioned, if the real goal of the evaluation is to evaluate people's reduction in vulnerability, then those longer term scales are needed.
Thank you for that answer. Another question here by Serge Eric Yakeo Dijam. Households' adaptive capacities depend on a number of household constraints, such their daily livelihoods, such as the case in mostly in Southern Asia. Have you identified some of those constraints of households towards adaptive capacity in your finding?
I would say no. We didn't really identify that, and that part can in part be explained by our sample. So our sample focused exclusively on project documents, project and program documents, and in particular the evaluation components of these documents. So while in the description of the activities or in the assumptions in some of the log frames, the constraints or risks were identified, they were not the primary focus of the information in our sample.
Okay. Another question from Serge. He makes a statement, and that's the following. For climate adaptation, baselines could be always in need of updates according to the uncertainty of the climate. Do you agree with this statement? And if yes, how can this be managed, the adjustments of baselines, also in regard to budget constraints of projects and programs in order to keep on target?
I think that's a very good question, and one that is not easy at all to answer. I think for everyone involved in M&E for adaptation, that's one of the main challenges, is how to incorporate the climate factor into M&E frameworks, and the fact that climates are changing, that corresponding baselines will change, but also that targets will have to change over time. So I think the advice given by an earlier panelist in the CEA webinar series is that it's very useful, and he mentioned that it's when doing M&E for adaptation, it's always important to be aware of the size of the activity and to formulate the M&E framework accordingly. So if you have a relatively small project, it might not make financial sense, or like the capacity of the implementing agency might be constrained. So it might not in that case make sense to use complex climate scenarios or to constantly adapt the framework as you go along. So for the smaller ones, I think it might be hard to justify, and either alternative measures will have to be used, or it will just have to be noted that this information is based on a static climate, although we are aware that it's changing over time. For really large programs, I think it must be prioritized to carefully integrate climate information and carefully define the baselines and targets.
Yeah. And if you talk about really big projects, you're thinking about infrastructure projects?
Infrastructure projects, but it can also be larger, like for example policy mainstreaming activities, where it's maybe on regional levels.
Yeah. Okay. Another question of Huyen, and he says, do you have any finding or a complete overview of indicators that are used for the various activities that have been researched? And I can understand that people are very interested to see more indicators, because what you presented here, I'm guessing, is only a small recap of the indicators that have been used in those various activities.
Exactly, and even then, for many of the indicators in the tables I showed, they were many indicators on the same topic, so I had to, or we had to kind of generalize them so they applied for the different agencies using the same indicator. To answer the question, no, we don't have a complete list of indicators that have been used. In the annex of our paper, we included the complete list of projects we identified. And for each of these projects, there is information and indicators available, but we did not compile an entire list. I mean, we did for our analysis, but not for publishing purposes.
Vladimir has a question. I'm only going to do 3 more questions because the time is running on. The question of Vladimir is the following. Should the M&E of programs, projects be passed on to the national government, national capacity, given that development agencies won't be likely to return after a certain amount of time to check the indicators?
I think that's a really good question, and it's also something that you hear more and more within the M&E community, is this concept of country-led evaluations. So basically it's the countries taking ownership of all these activities that are taking place in their countries, and it's them that do the M&E frameworks, or the evaluation, sorry. This is also fits very nicely within kind of the 8 effectiveness agenda, where you have like for example the Paris Declaration and the Accra Agenda, and now also the Busan Agreement, which all kind of promote country ownership. But I think the challenge in doing this is that in some countries there will be the both human but also institutional capacity might be a constraint. And also it might be a bit much to ask the countries to do. So if countries do it, I think it will have to be based on their own desire to do so.
Yeah.
And it will be difficult for funding agencies to pass it on to the countries.
Yeah, yeah. A question of Joni Verdi Wijaya. Considering the complexity of adaptation, do you think that log-frame is the best tool for M&E for adaptation activities, or are there other better tools or recommendations from your side to seek for other tools?
It's a hard question because the advantage of using the log frame or logical framework approach is that it's very established practice. So it's something that funding agencies have been using for a very long time, and it's gone through a number of revisions. So it's a fairly established tool, but it's also been heavily critiqued by a number of people for being too constrained in its format, and not allowing the flexibility of revising baselines, targets and milestones as we know are likely to be needed in the context of adaptation. In terms of alternative approaches, what I have seen is the use of, instead of log frame approach, that you create a standard questions that you use for every context. Again, this is something that has been presenting in an earlier webinar here at CEA, and something that it's at least it's different. So for every activity you ask who are the beneficiaries, what are their main needs, how can we address those needs, and so on. So that might be an alternative approach.
Yeah, yeah. You are referring to earlier webinars. One you referred to earlier was the one that was done last month by Patrick Pringle of UK CIP, Learning to Adapt.
Exactly.
And another one you're referring to was by Ms. Silva Villanueva, who looked at ADAPT principles, which dates back October last year or November last year, and both of them can be found on our platform as recordings if people would be interested. And now really the last question came in from Jeremy Diner, and he says, can you give us insight into good M&E processes being conducted by smaller and shorter climate change adaptation projects? Is it actually even worth the effort if projects are that small or short?
I think that's a difficult question to answer, whether it's worth it. I think that will very much depend on what both the funding and the implementing agency are getting out of it, because in addition to measuring whether you achieve what you set out to do, a key component of M&E is also to learn and to incorporate those learnings in subsequent activities. So I think it's important not to lose sight of that fact, which is probably more important than actually be able to tick off at the end of the day, yes, we achieved, we managed to make 4,000 households less vulnerable to climate change. It's like, okay, given this, what have we learned and how can we incorporate this in our subsequent activities? Mm-hmm. So I think it is important to evaluate your activities. How it is done, I think it needs to be adjusted by resources available. And in terms of smaller scale, M&E framework for smaller scale activities, it's not something I can identify or think of at the top of my head, because usually the M&E frameworks that are being proposed, they don't indicate whether or not they are meant for larger or smaller scale activities. Mm-hmm. So I think it's useful to look at what is out there and then, depending on resources, adapt it to the context.
Yeah, I think especially with smaller and shorter projects, at times it might feel to M&E professionals as if they are only doing the M&E process for the sake of making the donor happy, but we shouldn't forget that at the same time it is also a learning experience for the organization itself and for future projects.
No, exactly, yeah.
That was the last question from Jeremy Diner, and Nicolina, I would like to thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us here at this webinar.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
And also thank you to all the attendees that have been here for listening in to this webinar, and we'll hope to see you again next time. Have a good evening.